Now for our opening keynote address under the title, When Values Lead, Business Follows. It's an absolute pleasure for me to welcome onto the stage a very well-known figure to all of us in the room and online. She is an accomplished business leader and a leading voice and convener on responsible business, sustainability, and ESG practices. We know her in her capacity now as the Chief Executive Officer of the National Business Initiative. But she extends her leadership into many areas, including chairing the World Federation of Exchanges Sustainability Working Group, as well as National Treasury's Sustainable Finance Working Group. She's also served on the strategy group of the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance. Before she comes up, allow me to quickly remind you that for this opening keynote, we might have an opportunity to take one or two questions from the platform. So please remember to go to the green button to put your question or your comment there. And then to the best of my ability, I will try and integrate that question in the Q&A that is to follow. Please may I ask us to put a warm round of applause for Madam Shameela Soobramoney.
Good morning all, and wow, it's such a privilege to be in this room today. I want to start off by saying a huge thank you to Trialogue. It's such an honor to be invited here and also to see so many familiar faces. So good morning, everybody. And of course, the weather in Joburg's not been great, so it's an even bigger achievement for you to have turned out this morning despite the storm at 3 a.m. And so let me begin firstly by acknowledging Madam Program Director Nozipho, our distinguished guests, colleagues, partners, and all of you who are shaping the future. And let's start by holding that thought for the rest of this conference, that you really are shaping the future. Good morning. I want to begin with a reflection. And it may sound simple, but it is deeply confronting. A few months ago, I visited a skills hub linked to one of our programs. I met a young woman, bright, capable, determined, who had done everything that we ask of young people in this country. She had completed her studies. She had applied for jobs. And she waited 2 years. And then she said something that stayed with me. She said, I don't need another opportunity to learn. I need an opportunity to be included so that I can grow. What she was asking for was dignity. What she was asking for was a meaningful earning opportunity. And her story is reflective of how many people we know. I would be surprised if there wasn't any of us in this room that knew at least one person who shared a similar story. And here we sit, and I would argue that us sitting in the room today probably represent the most fortunate 2% of the people in this population. So that stayed with me, and I want us to understand that the distinction between preparation and participation is where the real work lies, and what we will reflect on in the conference over the next 2 days. It's where policy intent meets implementation, and it brings us directly to the theme of today and for the conference, is when values lead, business follows. Because every decision a business makes is an act of world-making and future building. We are part of those decisions every day. It's what we choose to fund, it's what we choose to build or not build, what we choose to lobby for in our policy lobbying efforts in the main elements of our businesses, and what we choose to measure, what we choose to ignore. These decisions determine who participates in the economy and who remains outside of it. Now, if we step back, there's certainly real progress that is worth recognizing. We certainly have more sophisticated ESG frameworks. We definitely corporate social investment holding resilient. We are seeing greater transparency in disclosure. And we are seeing, despite some of the global challenges, that sustainability is still keeping its place on the agenda. Trialogue's work over time has come to highlight that CSI investment in South Africa has remained significant and resilient. Education continues to receive the largest share of funding, and collaboration is widely seen as essential. Alongside that progress, however, a different pattern persists. Progress on key issues such as alleviating poverty, inequality, and unemployment halting environmental degradation, and creating real economic growth all seem to have stalled and in some cases posted a reversal in gains. And so it seems that we still struggle to translate that investment into sustained economic participation. And it tells us something important. The challenge isn't commitment. The challenge seems to be coherence. Global funding cuts have exposed the vulnerability of our civil society sector, but as I mentioned, corporate giving has remained resilient, and it creates a critical gap where business must step in with greater strategic intent. CSI should and can evolve to become a catalyst for economic inclusion, investing in the institutions and the ecosystems that enable sustained participation in the economy rather than just temporary relief. And so the opportunity for CSI2 is collaborative action for systemic change. We are missing a conversation on how these billions can converge on a set of strategic priorities that become the base of a capital stack that is intentionally catalytic. This is where, as critical in the room today, and people who are part of that economy need to work in defining the new frontiers of what it really means to blend capital. And so let's think a little bit about where values can really show up. Because values in this conversation can sometimes be misunderstood. They're not what we say, and they're not what we post on our corporate walls, but they certainly translate into what we tolerate and what we do. They show up in trade-offs. When profit conflicts with inclusion, what wins? When speed conflicts with participation, who's left out? When short-term performance conflicts with long-term resilience, what gives? This is where values live, not in strategy documents, but in decisions under pressure. If we are serious about redefining business success, then we need to move beyond the idea that profit and purpose still sit in tension. And even this statement is not new. So the real question is, do we need to ask ourselves, what kind of profit? Created how? And at whose expense or benefit? Because long-term value creation, really value depends on systems that are inclusive, stable, and sustainable. Almost anything else really is deferred risk. So I want to talk a little bit about the organization that I come from, because I was also asked to share a few examples. And in South Africa, in our case, this is not theoretical. The NBI is a 31-year-old institution and was founded on a very simple premise, and that is that business cannot thrive in a society that fails. And I have no doubt that is that statement that has brought all of you here today, and that is what drives your purpose in the work that you do. But today, the reality is even more urgent. If we just take one data point, and that is unemployment sitting at 30% and above, and youth unemployment, depending on the age category, exceeding 60%, we're not dealing with a marginal issue. We're dealing with the structural constraint on growth, and we need all hands on deck in looking at what is the systemic change that is required for us to do that. Which means that our leadership needs to evolve, and leadership today is measured not only by performance, but by the contribution to national resilience. And it is that resilience that all of our businesses actually depend on to grow. And so what does it look like when values actually lead? It looks like moving beyond intention into implementation. It definitely looks like a young person moving into meaningful work, and in so doing into dignity and hope. And for those of you who this sounds a little bit familiar, if you were at NBI's 30th birthday, you would know why. It looks like a small enterprise entering a value chain that was previously closed and which it could not have hoped to access, but can now. It looks like dignity restored through participation in an economy. I want to share with you a LinkedIn post by somebody, a young lady who came from no employment into employment, one of the programs, and it says better than I ever could what this means. It's by Valisha Sambo, and Valisha was somebody that qualified through one of the NBI programs, and her post is titled From Assistant Plumber to Qualified Plumber, and reads, in 2022, I qualified as an assistant plumber through the NBI, a milestone that opened the door for me to step into the plumbing industry with passion and purpose. Today, I'm proud to share another major step in my journey. I have officially completed my trade test and am now a qualified plumber. This achievement represents years of learning, hands-on experience, continuous growth, and commitment to excellence. I've enjoyed building my skills, serving clients, and growing through every opportunity that came my way. And she reflects on, with little arrows, assistant plumber, field experience, trade test, qualified plumber. And she said it's a full circle moment that reflects dedication, progress, and vision. And with a thank you to everyone who's been part of that journey for your support and belief in me that have meant so much. Felicia currently has gone on to employ others and started in an industry that normally, usually, generally, women wouldn't find them in, right? How many female plumbers do you know? But has broken that barrier, and it was through the intentional impact of programs that were put together with sponsorship by business such as yours in a coordinated fashion through institutions such as the NBI, and many other stories exist, but it was intentional and it was inclusive. Those programs ensured that at least 50% of women were at least in the application process. And what we've also found is actually those that stayed the course and finished were predominantly women. And so these are where intention meets actual implementation and where you look at collective accountability and intentional inclusion. And so we've seen this through in our demand-led skills programs linked directly to industry needs, but partnering with community-based TVET colleges so that when we say community, it has a face and a heartbeat. It is not something we put in our materiality matrix in our corporate reports to tick the box of stakeholder engagement. We see through climate finance initiatives mobilizing billions into green sectors, which not only create employment opportunities into new growth sectors and create resilience in existing sectors, but quietly shape a new kind of economy while helping secure lower carbon futures with huge multipliers on building resilience and creating better health outcomes. We see it in just transition work showing up that sustainability and inclusion can and must go hand in hand, but that it requires deliberate effort, yes, valuing an outcome of fuller participation of all of our people and the benefits which come with it. And these are not isolated successes. They are signals of what becomes possible when values shape decisions. When values lead, capital can flow. When values lead, partnership certainly follows and enables. When values lead and accountability is ingrained, outcomes will follow. So let's talk a little bit about inclusion and the necessity around a shift in design. And so there's a hard truth that we need to confront in the room. And often we design solutions for communities instead of with them. And then we ask why impact does not sustain and inclusion is not a moral add-on. It is a design principle. When the right voices are not in the room, we don't just miss perspectives, but we miss the outcomes we are seeking to design and put significant effort into. And this is something that we are seeing more clearly. When inclusion happens, impact lasts longer and really creates the foundation for the long-term growth that we are all seeking. And so as we look at this and looking at CSI from spend to systemic impact, let me speak to the social investment community, because this is really where the opportunity is most immediate. We know, as I've stated already, that investment is there, intent is there, commitment seems to be there, but we also know that efforts are fragmented. Capital is not always aligned, and impact is not always scaled. These are not new insights, but what is changing now is the urgency to move beyond them. The opportunity then is for us to shift from spend to investment. And investment really needs outcomes. Those of you that work in the financial services industry, and I would argue in any business, there's always has to be an outcome to any investment, and the same needs to hold true for every rand we spend into social investment. Projects need to shift into systems and system change, and outputs into outcomes. Because when we align capital around those shared priorities, we do move from incremental impact to systemic change. And I can certainly share lots of examples of what we've seen in the collaborative action that the NBI has been able to do, and what I've seen in so many of the corporates, many of whom sitting in the room today, and are also members of the NBI, you've seen through some of those projects. And so let's look at those values as a competitive advantage and not frame them as constraints. They're not something that slows down business, but the reality is the opposite. The businesses that succeed in the future are those that are understanding better and better that trust is a competitive advantage. Those of you that follow the Edelman Trust Barometer over the last number of years would have seen over time the actual increase in trust in business. And the barometer, for those that don't know, really measures the trust levels that civil society has in each of business, government, and the media and NGOs. And interestingly, trust in businesses increased. Not surprisingly in some instances, but also means is that the imperative for business to act on that trust and actually grow its own base is staring us in the face as an opportunity. So inclusion definitely can drive innovation, and sustainability can underpin resilience. I'm hoping that some of those examples I shared have taken that more from words into reality. And so it really comes down to competitiveness. At the end of the day, we need a competitive economy, and we need to bring all of the best that we can do into shaping the innovativeness that is required for that. And every one of you sitting in the room today is a steward over the kinds of money that can shape that. So impact is not failing because of a lack of funding, but certainly because of a lack of alignment. It is an alignment of the values, capital, partnerships, and the decision-making. And that's where the next phase of impact is going to be won. And I want to leave with a little call to action. Starting today, can we ask these 3 questions? Who's in the room when your most important decisions are made? And importantly, who is not? And if the key stakeholders are not there, why are they not there? What are you measuring when you are, and what are you ignoring because it's harder to quantify? And what behaviors are actually being rewarded inside your organization? Because these are the things that will tell you everything you need to know about your real values versus your espoused values. So connecting all of that, I really would like to call on leaders to make space for reflection and systemic thinking. It's one of the things that I have noticed in the last few years, especially in my current role, is that the biggest cry I hear from leaders is that we don't have time to think. We are in a world that has become ever more busier, ever more all-consuming, ever more consumed by doom scrolling, ever more consumed about a number of factors that honestly detract from our ability to apply our collective mind into systemic thinking. If we are not able to create the space for our thinking, how do we become architects of the change? How do we identify the opportunities that are sitting there, and how do we bridge those gaps? And so my biggest task actually is for us to create the space for systemic thinking, where we will start to think about what those values need to be. Let's use those values to build the vision for inclusive growth. All of us that sit in corporate talk about our corporate vision and our strategy, right? And the double click on that of that vision becomes strategy. But let's use the values to build the strategy that is the world we want, and let's use our voice to amplify that, and let's use our money to invest in that. Because if we don't have a clear collective vision, which is driven by the time that you need to put into systemic thinking and into being able to understand what that means and how that means you need to shift, then we will continue to lack the impact that we need to have, and we miss the huge opportunity of the significant money that we have really being an architect for the future. So let us work together with understanding what those values needs to be. And again, my provocation, make time to think. And I'm going to conclude, thank you, Madam Program Director and Kathy, with saying that one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest opportunities right now that we're looking at is, of course, the advent of this AI world that we're living in. But one of the biggest criticisms being leveled at that is that we are losing our ability for critical thinking. So if we're not making the time for critical thinking, all of the things we're talking about today will come to naught. Is ChatGPT generating your CSI strategy? Or are you really sitting with voices in the room and asking what those problems are that you need to solve? Thank you, leaders. I appreciate the time.
Who's in the room and who's not, and why not? What are we actually measuring? But more importantly, what are we ignoring because it's just too difficult to quantify? And then finally, what behaviors are being rewarded in your organization? Thank you so much for that call to action, and of course, for calling us out for perhaps not making the time to think. Being here feels like you're in a space where just for a moment, Trialogue has created space for us to pause and allow ourselves to lift our heads towards that systemic thinking. I'm going to not take too much of a time. We've only got about 10 minutes on the clock, but I perhaps wanted to just circle back to an honest question. You spent most of your career building frameworks, building coalitions, all around the idea of holding business accountable to their responsibility to society. If we were to have an honest assessment of how we're actually doing, are we seeing progress in this regard, or are we getting really good at just talking about the shift while not actually doing the work?
So, Nozipho, I think the first part is that we need to acknowledge the progress that has been made, and we can start to quantify some of that.
Yeah.
But I think if we were to give a more honest reflection, is that we are in transition, but we are not yet transformed. But that also poses an opportunity, because we are then architects of that transition.
Sure.
And that's where we sit at this point in time. And, to my last point, I hope we're not the last generation that is going to have the benefit of critical thinking. And that is really important for us. So we've seen the rise of frameworks and standards, and in the broader sustainability space, I'd like to call it that. But what matters, and it matters that we've created somewhat a common language, but the common vision and the taking back the power and saying, but we need to architect what all of those things are intending to deliver as an outcome is where our opportunity lies right now. So we have become very sophisticated about describing the shift.
Yeah.
We've got the right language, the right text. But when we have to ask about outcomes and create the linkages through and really describe the theory of change that we're looking for, that's where I think the huge opportunity lies right now.
Yeah. And that's quite interesting that you highlight that we've mastered the language, we've mastered the description, but perhaps the next invitation is to really think about how do we master the collaboration, the actual action, so that we don't talk about common vision, but not be able to act common vision. I want to maybe go a little bit deeper into the E in ESG, and that's the environment, because I think that's potentially where we see the rubber really hitting the road, where we see almost a deviation between what business says about climate and then how business acts with regards to climate and the kind of decisions that business will follow through on. What does that say about the values that inform the kind of decisions we bring into the climate conversation and climate action? And if there is a gap, in your view, how do we close that gap?
That is not an easy question, Nozipho. So I think we often see that, climate protection, I want to call it that, is not consistently treated as a core value in decision making. And it's often treated as a constraint. But I want to question whether that should be a value in the first place. And I'll leave that open to everybody. Because what we are finding right now is that it's a business imperative. And that's usually where it's an easier conversation in the boardroom. When you can start to see the risks materializing, or at least your risk systems are able to see that, it finds its way in the boardroom. And I think that's the challenge that we have often as corporates, is that how do I find this conversation in the boardroom? I might see myself as a sustainability practitioner or otherwise, but am I in the periphery? And how do I want this to become mainstream?
Yeah.
And, Nozipho, my background is actually a corporate strategist. My background is strategy and finance. But sustainability was always, for me, really, really interesting from a strategic perspective. And I think is why it's the field that, I found needs the most attention to. And so my experience as a corporate strategist is to get it on the boardroom table. It needs to make rands and cents.
Yeah.
But there absolutely is a space for the conversation on leadership around values. So I want to talk about a little bit about why we often find that there's a gap existing when the values are tested in the trade-offs that we spoke about earlier on. And climate doesn't always win in those trade-offs. And it's not surprising. And I'm just going to refer to my notes because otherwise I'm going to say it inarticulately. And this is something that anybody who knows me knows I've said for a long time, is that our way of measuring in success in business and financial markets was never made to safeguard environmental and social outcomes. This is the constraint we're living with. The financial system was never premised off protecting those things. Yeah. And so we continue to be measured and try to measure and force fit into a system that was never created to measure that. And so it has to be a deliberate intention about understanding that that's where we live and taking the right decisions in spite of that constraint. It means an entire rearticulation of their journey with your board to understand differently, to actually instill, I'm going to call it a bit of a moral compass, and maybe that's a bit heavy, but to actually say, I need to value that. But I also need to start having conversations for all of us in the room that stop a siloed way of thinking If you grow up in marketing, you think marketing. If you grow up in accounting, you think accounting. If you grow up in economics, traditionally, you think traditional economics. Put us all together in the boardroom, and that is never going to protect the environmental and social outcomes. So we need to shift that conversation, which means that it is imperative of all of us in the room to begin systemic thinking and become articulate in those areas that are outside of your norm. Because you're going to have to put that conversation together in the boardroom. You're going to have to convince a CFO why he needs to care about the environment. And not just through sustainability reporting, and I'm going to make that point very quickly. We're in a point in our country right now where there's a conversation happening about potentially making sustainability report mandatory, and there's a roadmap discussion that is underway. That is potentially going to be quite a costly exercise, because with that comes the kind of resources you need to put into reporting, the kind of resources you need to put into assurance, and those sorts of things. Who is protecting the outcome and the intent of such reporting? What is it meant to drive if we are putting so much effort into it? And so this is an open invitation to all our leaders in the room today. Please be part of the conversation. And if we're saying that the country needs to solve for poverty, inequality, unemployment, the outcomes for a just and equitable transition, surely those are the things we need to be measuring in those frameworks. Because you measure what you treasure. Do we even know that the process is underway? Because it's probably the single biggest thing right now that is going to drive some of those outcomes. And it's an opportunity, because once it's on the boardroom table and it's mandatory, your CFO will care. Your risk manager will care. But what are you asking them to care about?
Sure. I think you use the language beautifully. You speak about a complete reorientation. And a reimagination of what it is that we actually value and what it is that we actually protect and treasure.
And Nozipha, it's a question about stewardship.
Sure.
And each of us actually has a responsibility as we're thinking about that. As a business community, ask ourselves in 10 years' time when you look back, what do you want to have put your hand up and said that you were actually an honest steward of? And where did you take those decisions?
What will you be judged on when the history books are being read? I just want to squeeze in a question from Marshall before I get to my final question in our last 3 minutes. And then just a quick reminder is to say, don't put your questions in the chat. Please put them in the question box. You've got to go to the bottom to the green box and put them there. So Marshall, I did wade through the chats and found your question, which I thought was a good one, because you started off by speaking about the amount that is actually invested in education. And Marshall says, with so much money channeled into education via CSI investments, in your view, Shameela, why do we continue to experience such low outcomes at national levels? Do you think the issue is that we're not investing at the right level, or are we just getting it wrong altogether?
We all need to concern ourselves with. And I mean, it's absolutely appalling when we look at the situation in relation to basic education. There is a systemic overhaul that, again, we need to look at. But I think it's also about accountability. There's a huge discussion around accountability. I don't even want to wade into the conversation around corruption and misspent money. And I think that is another conversation that we need to have. And so where we're investing absolutely matters. Thank you, Marshall. And it's driving those outcomes and accountability. So that, again, is a conversation I think that corporates can weigh in on quite substantively. Because the product of that education system is what we're employing in our companies. And so let's look back and think about what we would like that to look like and how we can shape that. And we sit at an intersection where corporates really have the privilege of having the ability, the money to look at that, be forward thinking, think about what's shaping the future, but then use that power to reverse engineer to saying, how can I meaningfully and constructively support the discussion on what that system needs to look like, and hence what it needs to invest in.
Fantastic. I've run out of time, but I'm going to just ask you in the last 30 seconds to speak to what is the one thing that you think the organizations in the rooms, the people in the room, sitting with budget responsibilities, with mandates, with influence, what is the one thing that they could do differently to make the calls to actions that we've made today a little bit more real? What is your call to action so that even this doesn't become a really good exercise of articulating the issues without acting on them?
So I know it's not an easy one. And I mean, I could give quick wins, but I think I'm really going to ask the uncomfortable question, is that, are you making time to think about what system you want to change? and how you're going to do that. And it really requires time, but it requires time to also make sure you bring the right voices into the room, even the ones that make you uncomfortable. Those are the ones that are going to provoke the thinking. Make those voices, but bring them in early on. Don't say, this is my strategy or this is what I'm doing, and then effectively go look for endorsement of it. It's bring the voice earlier on to shape the conversation, but I want us to take it a level higher. We need to think about the systems we want to change and where's the opportunity for us to bring that money together to literally select 2 or 3 systems, including the education one, and say we need collaborative action. Because we do, as corporates, have the tendency to approach things for what can I affect in my space. But these challenges require systemic change.
Sure.
And so the bringing together of that money is going to be critical, but it needs the time to think and the platforms to collaborate.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's please give Shameela Soobramoney a big round of applause. Thank you very much.